Okay, next we're going to go to the AA configuration on the iOS. We're going to do this via TACACS. So let's see what are going to be the configuration steps on the router side and then on the TACACS side. So on the iOS, we have to first start the AA process to begin with, because otherwise we're going to use the old model of AA, which doesn't allow integration with remote servers. So we have to start the AA process. It's going to be the command A new model. So we want to allow the new model means that we can actually authenticate incoming requests to the router for management purposes to a remote server. Then we have to configure the integration with the remote TACACS server. Then we have to configure a local username and password, because as I stated, we're going to use integration with the TACACS server with a fallback on a local database. So that's why we also define a local username in the database of the router. Then we configure the authentication, authorization, and accounting with the TACACS server and a local fallback. Well, of course, accounting is only supported via TACACS Plus, but authentication and authorization is going to be done via TACACS Plus with a local fallback. So in case TACACS Plus is not available, we're going to authenticate the users and authorize the users connected to the router via the local database. Now, when we define those authentication, authorization, and accounting lists, if non-default AA lists are used, we have to apply the AA lists to the VTI lines. I'm going to speak in a couple when we get to authentication, to the configuration part in more detail. If you use the default list, which depends, then you don't have to apply them on the VTI lines, because the default list is going to be by default applied in there. Pretty much that's going to be the steps, the configuration part on the iOS. On the TACACS server side, we first configure the integration with the network access device, which is going to be the router with the authenticator. We configure the local username and password, because the TACACS server is going to validate the user's credentials. Then we configure the authorization profiles or attributes, which means when the user gets authenticated, what privilege level do you assign to that user? And also, which commands is that user allowed to use on the router? And once we have defined the authorization attributes, we have to bind those together in the authorization list. Now, of course, it doesn't mean you have to do both authentication and authorization and command authorization and accounting. Ideally, you're going to do that because you want accounting because you want to know which users have done which commands on which devices. You want command authorization because you don't want all users to have the same access to all commands on a network device, because you're going to have, like, some junior administrators, some senior, and some experts, and you want to give them different access to the commands of the router to make sure they don't accidentally put a command in there which does a big mess in the network. So ideally you're going to do accounting, I said why, and command authorization, I said why, but it's not mandatory to do it, of course. Only the authentication part is mandatory. Then verification wise, we verify the TACACS server. We say show TACACS or show AA servers detailed to see if the server is up and what is the configuration with that server. We verify the configured AA lists, the authentication, authorization, and accounting lists, which show AA method lists all, or of course show run include AA. And optionally, before we even telnet to the router or SSH to the router to get authenticated, we can test the authentication to see if authentication would succeed against the AA server. Command being test AA group TACACS Plus. If you define the server globally, then you put in there the username and the password, and then it's going to send their credentials over to it's going to simulate an authentication process with that username and password. So our use case is going to be like follows. as follows. So we're going to configure, let's say, router 3 is going to be the supplicant. Because router 3 is going to telnet or SSH over to router 2. Telnet or SSH. So 2 is going to be the authenticator. And 2 is going to validate the credentials against the ACS server, who becomes the authentication server via TACACS Plus. So let's first do the authentication part. And as I said, we're going to do the authentication part with a fallback on the local database of router 2. So let's do a step by step. We go on router 2. And first of all, we say a new model. Now, once you do this, because this command means I want to be able to communicate with remote servers for authentication purposes, which means that the authentication can only be done via username and password. It makes sense that when you type in this command, it's going to change the VTI lines from password-based authentication to username password-based authentication. This command doesn't affect the console for security reasons, not to get yourself locked out of the console. But this command affects the VTI lines. It changes over the default authentication of password to username password. Next step to define a TACACS server, it's a lot of configuration options. I'm going to use the old one, TACACS server host, the ACS server 172.16.1.100, and what is the key? CISCO TACACS. Of course, this key has to match in between the router 2, the authenticator or the NAD, and the ACS server or the authentication server. It says that it's going to be deprecated soon. Please move to the TACACS server name part. Let's do it. Let's do it the new way. I'm going to show you the new commands. Know this. So we define TACACS server name, TACACS server in the name ACS, and we put in there then the address of the server, IPv4 172.16.10.100. And we define a key as well to be, key is going to be, I said, CISCO TACACS. Exit. So we define the server to be ACS, and I want to use a key of CISCO TACACS to secure the communication between router 2 and the ACS server. Next we say AAA group server TACACS Plus. Server group name, let's say TACACS servers. And in here, you bind the TACACS server name you used before, name ACS. And pretty much that's it. So show run section TACACS and AAA. So you define a new model. If you don't do that, you cannot configure TACACS server. Then you configure the TACACS server by giving him a relevant, giving that container a relevant name. It's not a container. You put in there what is the IP address of the TACACS server and what key is used to secure the communication back and forward. And then you define a group of servers of type TACACS, give it a name, and then you say this group of servers where you can specify multiple TACACS servers. I'm using in my case only one TACACS server. And then you say AAA authentication login, which this means all login requests to the router, which means SSH, Telnet, console, VTI. So VTI, console, HTTP, doesn't matter. Any kind of management access, login access to the router is going to use what I'm going to specify next. Now, if you use the default list applies by default to all methods of managing the router, which means console, VTI, and HTTP. So I don't want you to use the default list because this is going to enforce authentication at the console as well, and I may get locked out of the console. I'm going to use a name list, authentication list, and I'm going to say that all authentication login requests to the router, I'm going to use this list, and I'm going to perform the authentication against the servers configured in that group of servers. And if none of those servers are available, I'm going to fall back on the local database, which means let's define a username locally. Username, router to user, password, router to user. So show run section AAA. Again, what I have done, enabled a new model to allow the configuration of remote servers. I have configured remote servers, defined a group of servers, and then I stated I want to authenticate all login requests. And I give, this is a list, a login list, I give it a name, and I say how to authenticate login requests. First via the TACAC servers, if they're not available, via the local database. And because I'm using a non-name list, it means if I want the VTI lines to be authenticated as configured, you go say line VTI 04 and you say authentication. You say login authentication. Like this. So you enforce the authentication at the VTI lines to be performed as configured in that list. This is because I'm using a non-name list, a non-default list. Because if I would use the default list again, when I defined the AAA authentication login list, if I would have used in here the default list, as the name states, that default list gets applied by default to all ways of coming in on the router, console, VTI, HTTP. But I didn't use the default, so you don't have to apply the default list to the VTI lines because it's applied by default. I don't use that list because I don't want console to get authenticated and not to lock myself out of the console. So let's do first the authentication part. Now let's go on the ACS server and do those steps in there as well. So let's go in here, go to the ACS server, HTTP S 172.16 100. Let's authenticate. Admin. It is ACS admin with a password of default 1A. So we follow up on those steps and we configure, first of all, the integration with the network access device. And this version of Chrome seems to not to work good. Let me use Mozilla for this. So based on the ACS or IOS version you're using, you have a recommended list of browsers to use. Otherwise, you may end up in weird behaviors, which means the GUI doesn't display properly, or you configure something and doesn't get applied. Okay, the first step was to do the integration, the communication with router 2. So we go under network resources, it makes sense. And we go to network devices and AA clients. And we say create or add. And now if you look in there, when router, I've configured A on router 2. When router 2 is going to send TACACS packets to the ACS server, it's going to source them with the IP address. It's going to say show IP route the ACS server, which means it's going to source the packets with that source IP address. But because, as you can see, I have redundant paths to the ACS server. And on the ACS server, I'm going to configure router 2 with, I want to configure router 2 only a single time. Ideally, I should go on router 2 and configure router 2 to source TACACS servers from the loopback. Because at that point, it doesn't matter what is the physical path which is going to be used for TACACS packets, it's going to always source the packets to the loopback. If I don't do that, and I define the server now on ACS, I define router 2 on ACS with this IP address, it means that if this link fails, when 2 is going to send the authentication request via TACACS to ACS this way, ACS is not going to recognize router 2 because it doesn't have this IP address defined as a client. So let's go on router 2. And it should be under a server group. It should not be in here because in here you just define the TACACS server, but let's confirm that. So it's not there. It should be, as I stated, from my point of view, under this configuration, because in here you just define how to communicate with that TACACS server. In here we define a group of servers and how do you speak with that group of servers. So let's see if that works. Server name and doesn't seem to show up in there. Maybe it's in here. Let's look again. Address IPv4 172.16.10.100. So I cannot specify the source in here. Let's say exit. Let's go back to the A server group. Server name ACS and IP TACACS source interface loopback 0. So this states that I want to source the packets with the loopback 0, which means 5552. We're going to define in here the router 2 with an IP address of 5552. And we don't use radius or use TACACS with a shared secret of CISCO TACACS. And we say submit. So the first step has been done. I'm not going to perform any authorization yet, as I stated. So the next step is to define the username in the local database of TACACS, which means I'm going to go under users and identity stores and into internal identity stores, under users, and add a user. And this is going to be, let's say, TACACS user with a password of TACACS user. And let's say submit. And the third step, because I've defined integration with router 2, I've defined the username because the TACACS server validates the credentials, and then I go under access policies, under default device admin, because under service selection rules in here, the default behavior of ACS states that if it's displayed properly, it says that Yeah, it's not being displayed properly. But this states that all incoming TACACS requests are going to be sent to the device administration access policy, which that's why I go under the default device admin. The authentication part is being done in the local database, and the authorization part, I don't do any kind of authorization, which means I'm going to fall back on the default rule which says permit access. So pretty much just for the authentication part, I'm going to be good enough. I'm going to be allowed access as long as the credentials are valid. So now before we go on router 3 and tenant over to router 2, we can go on router 2 and perform the test function to see if the credentials are valid, which that's going to also validate if the integration with the TACACS server is properly done. So let's go on router 2 and say test AAA group. The name of the group, not TACACS Plus, because this means that the TACACS Plus host was defined globally. I have defined it under a server group, which the server group name was TACACS servers. Username, I can specify to which server because in that group I can have multiple servers. In my case, it's only one. What is the username? TACACS user. What is the password? TACACS password. And then you have to specify something in there. Legacy or new code. It's not a long discussion. I'm going to choose legacy because it's going to work always. Legacy. It says attempting authentication to server group using TACACS Plus. No authoritative response from any server. Let's make sure I can, for example, ping with a source of loopback 0. So I have IP connectivity. Let's go on the TACACS server, and we're going to go under system under monitoring and reports. We're going to go under launch monitoring and report viewer to see if the TACACS server has received a request and see what the problem is. So we go to reports, catalog, a set of predefined reports, and we go to not catalog, to favorites, a set of predefined reports, and we go to authentication TACACS today. And nothing shows up in there. Which, let's say again, show run section TACACS and AAA. So this was, well, there we go, that's a problem, right? I have defined, I have added in there server A, not ACS server. So let's remove this and put the proper IP address of the ACS server, which is 172.16.1.100. There we go. Now let's do the test again. And it says rejected. This time I got communication with the TACACS server and says user authentication request was rejected by server. So now if I say refresh in here, I should see what the problem is. Favorites and authentication TACACS today. And it says wrong password or invalid share secret. So either the TACACS key is misconfigured between router 2 and the TACACS server, or, which is obvious, the problem is that I have put in there a wrong password because I have configured on the ACS server both the user and the password to be TACACS user. So let's do it the proper way. TACACS user. And I got successfully authenticated. That was a simulation of the authentication part. which means now when I'm going to telnet from router 2, from router 3 to router 2, 2 is going to prompt it to get authenticated. Then 3 is going to send the credentials over to 2. 2 is going to validate them against the TACACS server. The server is going to say OK. And 2 is going to say OK to router 3. And I should get connected successfully at the VTI lines of router 2. So let's go on router 3 and telnet to router 2. Before we do that, let's verify our configuration. So as I said, show TACACS. So I have one TACACS server configured, and socket opens and closes because I have sent 2 authentication requests. Total packet send and receive. Failed connection attempts 1 because initially I have defined a wrong TACACS server, which was the ACS. Show AAA servers detailed. Yeah, this command doesn't work if you use the new configuration. So only show TACACS can work. And show AAA method list. Show AAA method list all to see the configured list, which should be my authentication list. There we go. That name, which is valid true, and I have configured that this is a authentication, a login type of list, which I named it like this, and I told the router to authenticate incoming login, all login requests against that group of servers in order to fall back on the local database. So let's go on router 3 and telnet to router 2. This is one obvious built-in proof that I am going to get authenticated against the TACACS server because the prompt says username with a low U, not a capital U. So username TACACS server, TACACS user, and password TACACS user. So I got authenticated successfully. Show privilege. I got a level of 15 because I've configured that on the VTI lines from a previous setup. Let's remove that. By default, the VTI lines have a level of 1. So let's telnet again, and I should get assigned a level of 1. TACACS user, TACACS user, and TACACS user. There we go. I got connected, and I'm in a level of 1 in there. Okay. Exit. Now let's configure the authorization part. So what I want now is to configure the exec authorization. So I want the ACS server, when I get authenticated, when I send the credentials over to router 2 and 2 sends them over to the ACS server, I want to get authorized and get access to privilege level of 15. To directly get access to level of 15. Couple of ways to do that. One is going to be we go in router 2 and we configure the exec authorization list. So if I want to get access directly to level 15, I'm going to say AA authorization. AA authorization exec. So when you get shell access, what is the authorization you receive? So I'm going to say exec, give that list a name. I'm going to say exec authorization list. I'm going to say that likewise I'm going to go to group TACACS plus servers with a fallback on local. If I want this to be enforced because I'm using a non-name list, line VTI 04 and authorization exec and the name of that list.